So let's have a look at this case study, the HartsCove wreck, a colonial wreck just off of Portsmouth near Salamander Point. But before we get into the wreck itself, just to cover a few of the rules and ethics that surround wreck sites. So since 1988, with the Abandoned Shipwrecked Act, all historic shipwrecks are covered by federal law. In New Hampshire, it was even before that. There was no collecting allowed after 1986. And so this concept of finders keepers really does not exist. All shipwrecks are owned by the state. They're responsible for anything within like shore waters. So despite this fascination with treasure hunting, the consequences soon outweigh that initial monetary value. So most often investors who put in with these large salvage companies never actually see a return on the money they've put in. And on the flip side, there's often so much of a loss of information to history. People put these collected pieces into their shoebox. It ends up in a garage. And eventually people attempt to donate these to maritime museums. And a lot of times these small places don't have the funding to preserve these artifacts because they're then responsible for them in perpetuity, forever. And you look to the left here, this is a small shallop that was common at the time. So let's get into this case study. So to start with, in about the 1960s, Ray Demers and a friend of his found this wreckage off Salamander Point, exposed out of the dirt on the bottom. And so as a sports diver at that time, it wasn't frowned upon for them to collect artifacts like it really is now. And at that point, they found 2 cannons. So with this initial discovery, he became very excited about finding out more of the maritime history right outside his door. He became committed to investigating these sites around Portsmouth. So unfortunately, some other divers on that particular wreck pulled the cannons off the bottom and dragged them ashore, which is severe disruption of the site. And Ray Demers, hearing what had happened, took it upon himself to rescue those cannons and attempt to preserve them. Any of the artifacts that he did collect, he did keep them together. And there's been a recent exhibit at the Sea Castle Historical Society out on Great Island. If you ask them, they might be able to tell you where the collection has gone next. And in his book, Piscataqua Discoveries, he states that his evidence that he's collected points to the wreck of an 18th century schooner owned by George Jackson. This contradicts an archaeological survey that was done, sponsored by the state with their archaeologist David Switzer. It was done in 1980. And because of this survey, part of the sentiment at that point, this led to that ending of sports divers removing objects. So in 1986, that was placed into law. So when Switzer took a look at the wreck, he only found a few artifacts such as you see at the bottom there. He recorded everything that he could see for the pieces of the ship that remained. And from what he saw of the construction and how those pieces were put together, he concluded that it was a small shallop like we saw in the first picture on this section from about 1690. So in conclusion, and this would be for the entire lecture looking at contact and the colonial era in the maritime world, you can see that early contact really promoted cross-cultural exchange, so looking at inventions and how these maritime ideas cross-pollinated, and so many of the Europeans who settled here took over these ideas of shore travel with canoes or dugouts. So one of the first people who made contact along the shore was John Smith, trading with the natives in 1614, and his explorations that led to that amazing map of the area and his identification of the Isle of Shoals. So then a lot of these transported goods, things that were going in and out of the Great Bay, up through to Dover and back down to the Strawberry Bank, these transportations would occur on the tide, so the rising tide helping the ships go in, and as the current turned, the ship would be pulled back out. So these would have been the gondolas and the small shallops, like the one in Hart's Cove, that would have transported things. And shipwreck archaeology that does get done in a very methodical manner can really contribute to the information that we have for history. So I recommend doing the quiz and heading on to the next lecture.